journals where you may wish to publish your work, and that is of course freely available online. And you may also be interested in using a database specific to your discipline, right? So for me, that would be library literature and information science full text. For you, that might be MLA or Scopus. Whatever you use to find articles to use in your research, that's also a place to find potential journals. But the best place to start, right, is with your own work. When you publish a work, you are making a contribution to a larger scholarly conversation. So it's important to, ask yourself, what journals is it that you read? What journals do you cite? If you find similar articles to what you'd like to write, where are those articles published? What journals are they citing? And once you think you may have found a journal, it's important to know the journal that you're publishing with. So I often recommend that you go to the website, right? Read some of the articles, know the audience and the tone of writing. I recommend identifying prospective journals really before you begin the writing process, right? Look at the contents, its focus, the structure and style. All are going to be shaped by and unique to the specific journal that you're working with, right? And so which conversations can you see yourself joining? If you're somewhat unfamiliar with a journal, you can come to know it through the works it publishes as well as its website. So this is the website for Glossa, a well-regarded journal in linguistics. And as we scroll through the website, we can read more about its focus, the scope of content that it publishes, how frequently that work is released, who is on the editorial team, and what are the policies and practices that shape the journal. We can look at the author guidelines, right? So what types of articles is it publishing? Research articles and reviews. What is the expected structure of those articles? What elements should they include? How are authors expected to deal with their own data? Glossa is truly exceptional in that it actually goes a bit further into the steps it takes to maintain the integrity of the research it publishes, right? Adhering to best practices in terms of transparent peer review processes and other ethical standards established by the scholarly publishing community, right? Familiarizing oneself with the journal and its practices are essential. And this is especially true as stories of publisher malpractice and deception are on the rise. Predatory journals, which I'm sure we've all heard of, whether we call them predatory, pseudo, sham, or fake, are essentially journals that solicit manuscripts for inclusion in objects that look like journals, right? So they include real articles sorted into volumes and issues, but that are dishonest about providing things we'd associate with traditional publication channels, right? So they may say they provide peer review, but their process does not actually provide your work with that benefit. They don't provide copy editing or indexing to ensure that your work reaches its intended audience. A very easy first indicator for identifying a predatory journal is whether or not it charges the author a fee to submit or publish. While some reputable and respected open access journals charge what are referred to as article processing charges or APCs, all predatory publishers charge them. In both cases, the fee supports some costs and some profit, but the distinguishing feature is that with a trusted journal, the fee has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not your publication is accepted. But with predatory publishers, they accept the publication because of the fees that they can charge, not because of the quality of the research or what it contributes back to the field. Sometimes it's fairly easy to identify them. I think we've all received an email like this. I know my inbox is flooded with them. And as I go through this email, I immediately see some red flags. So there's a really unspecific address to me and in the signature, right? So they're not saying, you know, Dear Megan Watcha, or providing the name of the editor, it's Dear Researcher. And this indicates that it's a form letter sent to a mass of people, right? Not any one researcher or editor involved in the dialogue. The scope of the journal is also quite broad and unspecific. It includes all of the humanities, social sciences, education, and their complementary discipline, etc. The review and publication dates are so condensed, right? So I think it's 5 days from paper submission to being notified of acceptance, and another 5 days from that notification to final publication. That doesn't actually give reviewers or an editorial board time to provide those services, which means that they aren't happening. This is really one of the defining elements of a predatory journal, right? The articles published by predatory journals or presented at predatory conferences might be good research, conducted well, with interesting findings. But without the benefits of peer review offered by journals with more transparent and ethical practices, they won't come with the same stamp of approval, that same prestige that the peer review process provides, and that's absolutely critical for your work and your career. And it's amazing because sometimes we don't even need to open the email to recognize a publisher's predatory practices, right? But at other times, we might come to the journal through a Google search, or even through a trusted channel. So for instance, a colleague may have been less discerning about the email invitation that came to them, published with a journal. They were excited that they were accepted and the process was so quick and easy. And they've shared it with you. And these cases can be a bit trickier in order to identify them. So again, we return to the website. Here we have the website for the Journal of Biomedical Sciences, not to be confused with the Journal of Biomedical Science, right? So they are choosing a name that's very similar to a respected journal. And the Journal of Biomedical Sciences is published by IMedPub, a subsidiary of Omics, which in 2016 became the first academic publisher to be sued by the US Federal Trade Commission for deceptive practices, including a claim of false affiliation with the US government, right? And you're not going to know this from their website. At first pass, yes, they have these advertise with us banners, and that might seem like a red flag. In some ways it is, you know, my spidey senses are tingling. But it's not uncommon for a reputable journal to generate revenue through advertisements. So that in and of itself isn't going to tell me that it's predatory. They list things like the impact factor. They promise a peer review process. They're very transparent about the fees that they charge. They collect real articles by real researchers, right? But if we dig a bit deeper, we see some inconsistencies emerge on other pages. The pages describing the editorial board, the author guidelines, right, are broad and seem to accept everything that would be submit to them. The journal claims to offer a peer review process, but doesn't explain what that process is or the timeline in which it happens. Articles don't have digital object identifiers attached to them, which is a standard practice in scientific publishing, less so in some other disciplines. And they say that, you know, search engines such as Google Scholar are used to promote how people will find your work, right? So they're not included in more trusted indices. New, since they lost the FTC suit, they also include a note that authors must pay a fee if they wish to withdraw their papers. They are transparent about it, they are honest, but it's far from a standard or ethical practice. Identifying a fake publisher, you know, for this really requires a critical eye. And there are a number of tools to help with that process. For instance, checklists that indicate the quality of a journal's practices. This one developed by librarians at Grand Valley State University. So these would be negative indicators that you may be working with a predatory or sham publisher. as well as positive indicators, right? Things that you want to see your journal doing, whether or not it's a predatory publisher, to be adhering to best practices, right? We can look to things like what editors or societies are involved with the journal. Does it clearly and transparently communicate the fees, its reuse policy, and author guidelines? Is it included in recognized databases and indices? This is something that's not only important for determining its reputation, but also, you know, whether or not people are going to find your work once it is published. There's another tool called ThinkCheck Submit that really encourages, you know, has a series of questions, a little bit less intensive than the one from Grand Valley State, that encourage authors to look at the journal and its contents, but also the context in which it was created, right? The editors, the publishers. Now, it takes time to evaluate a journal in this way. And I'm often asked, isn't there just a list of publishers that I should avoid? And there are lists, but blacklists reflect the biases of their creators, and they often conflate lower quality and less experienced with predatory. At their worst, they've been shown to be xenophobic and racist, excluding journals published out of the developing world or with editors who don't speak English as a first language. There have actually been multiple cases in which a journal or a publisher was blacklisted simply because they weren't aware of a practice that's typical in North America and Europe. And then upon addressing the issue, which they did, they had difficulty removing themselves from these blacklists. So, you know, it's tricky, right? Even some top tier journals wouldn't meet all of the criteria used to designate a journal as trustworthy. You know, for instance, a small scholarly, something coming out of a small scholarly society, or in the humanities where they have a rich peer review process, but maybe not the infrastructure to assign DOIs to the work. The good news is that if you want to pair your evaluation of a journal with an evaluation made by others, there are lists of vetted journals and publishers, such as those from the Directory of Open Access Journals, the Committee on Publication Ethics, and OASPA. So once you've identified one or more trusted journals to potentially publish with, there are additional considerations to make in order to ensure that your manuscript is accepted. And so I will pass it to Tracy.
Thank you. You're still going to click, right?
Yes.
Okay, click. This reminds me of 30 years ago when you'd have a student moving a transparency on an old vector. I want to switch a little bit from the journals in the sense of you've now selected a journal, or in reality, I always advise my students, you want to have at least 3 journals. We're overloaded now with people submitting manuscripts. There's more and more research. There's more and more pressure to publish for students than there was 30 years ago. So part of it is you want to have a number of journals that fit your criteria, that your article would belong in. And just as Meg said before, it may be because they've published a lot on this topic, or it may be that they haven't, but it's an important topic in the field. But picking the journal is incredibly important because your introduction, I always call it your front door into the journal, is going to have to fit the journal's mission. So if you submit it to one journal and it's rejected, and then you submit it to another, you have to make sure they have a similar mission, or you may need to change your introduction to fit it. That's often, so as someone who wakes up at 7 o'clock and while they're having their coffee, looks through the morning set of articles that have come in, one of the biggest reasons articles are rejected is because they don't fit the journal's mission. It might be a brilliant study, but it has nothing to do with your journal. This says to me a lot, authors haven't even bothered to look at the webpage, to look at the mission statement. So that's a second reason why you want to follow the guidance that Meg gave you before about really selecting a journal your research fits. The second reason they're rejected, and these are going to go back to things you've heard in your grad school courses or that we all know, but I can't say it strongly enough. Your paper has to be well conceptualized. You can't have writing that's flying all over the place. So that you have to fit the mission, but you also have to make the case in the beginning for how you're conceptualizing your study, what research question you're asking, what gap in the literature you're filling, and how this fits with the journal. If they've recently published articles on your topic, you can say, as shown in this journal, there's child mental health is an important issue during the era of COVID. The other one, so obvious, but actually very surprising, many articles are rejected because the research design is poor and it can't answer the question. This isn't just on your shoulders, it's on your mentor's shoulders, but this goes back to publication really starts when you're designing a study. So when you're designing a study with your mentor, when you're thinking of your dissertation, even at preliminary times, think about, where might this be published? Who would be interested in this? Yes, we all know results often take you in different directions, but it's not a bad idea at that point to be thinking of it as you come up with specific aims, as you come up with research questions. Another one that accounts for rejection is poor writing. Now, I'm not talking just about English, even though when I do get manuscripts from non-English speakers that are basically unreadable, I have to send them back and say to them, it would be great if you could get an English speaker, because we're an English language journal, to look over this manuscript. Many people use a computer program. It just doesn't work. They write it in another language. So you may not even have it reviewed. But really, by poor writing, I'm talking about clarity. You have to be able to give the narrative of your research, why it's important, what you did, how you did it, what you found. That narrative has to be clear to the reviewers. So again, moving back, once you've selected the journal, as Megan said, you can look at the editorial board, but they often, the associate editors don't often do the reviews. You can look at the editorial board. Sometimes they do a ton of reviews, sometimes they don't. But those are the people you want to make sure understand. And sometimes your manuscript is sent to someone exactly in the area. Other times it's just sent to other generalists. So you have to make sure you're not using lingo that someone else wouldn't explain. Variable names in SPSS or SAS don't make for a good read. So it's really important that once you've drafted it, you're redrafting it and you get others to look at it. Friends, I always say, get your friends to be your enemies, to find everything wrong with it before it goes to the editor. Once it's flown into submission, you have no control over it. Okay, next slide. So again, repeating some of what Meg said, because it's so important. The scope of the journal, do you fit the mission? Who are you writing to? If you're writing to practitioners, they may not want to hear about basic science. Time to publication. This is critical if you are on the job market, going for a postdoc. If a journal has a publication lag of 3 years, it's not going to do you a lot of good. So you want to look for what I would call a reasonable lag. It depends upon the field. Again, it's not the 2 weeks of a predatory journal, nor should it be 3 years. The other thing Meg and I talked about the other day that's new, I think you want to hit the next slide actually, is you want to look at whether the lag to publication online versus print. So once your article is accepted, many journals within a week or two will have it online with its DOI. It can be accessed through all kinds of databases. It's your final version that's been accepted, but it's not what we call the print version, even though many journals no longer actually have a print version, but they still have a print version. And that might not come out for 1.5 years, but you do have that published article that is legitimate for job searches, for jobs, for postdocs, all kinds of things. So if that's not clear in the instructions to author, it is perfectly fine to email the managing editor, not the editor-in-chief, but the managing editor who handles the day-to-day business. They'll be on the website, and just nicely ask, could you tell me what your current lag is for publication, both print and online? That's a person you communicate with. You shouldn't be afraid to write at all, to say what's happening with my manuscript. Another thing you can look at is the reputation of the editorial board. Again, I want to make the distinction for you. Most journals have a set of associate editors, also called action editors, sometimes called consulting editors. It's a short list. And they're the people who are actually going to be handling your review. They're in charge of the whole process. They will then ask 2 to 3 peer reviewers to review your article. Someone who's on an editorial board is usually there because of their expertise and because they've reviewed maybe 5 to 8 articles during the past year. They're good citizens. They know the subject area. But it can also go out to, we have a pool of 1,000 or more ad hoc reviewers. So editorial board gives you a sense of the kinds of topics that are in the journal because it's the topics the AEs, the associate editors, have expertise in. The other things you can look at are metrics. I can say in public health, I see a CV of someone, the impact factor is on there. Yes, in my lab, we do discuss high versus low, but part of it is you have to think about what the quality of your manuscript is. The impact factor is telling us how much impact a journal has as defined by the number of times it's cited. There's a formula for it. There's a 1-year impact factor, a 2-year, a 5-year. Often journals will put the best one on their website. And if any of you are statisticians or you've had statistics, you know with regression to the mean, what goes up must come down. So I am getting lauded this year for a huge bump in my impact factor, which is great, except I know I'm going to get yelled at next year because it almost has no place to go but down a little bit. It adjusts. So don't live by the impact factor unless you're looking more for a public health job. It tells you both how many people are not reading the article, but they're citing it with the implication that research that's cited is better. But it's also that research is more in the mainstream than on the margins that are new ideas. The mainstream gets cited more too, which is why there are many articles about questioning the impact factor. There are other metrics now. I don't think we have them on a slide, Megan, but Clarivate, and there are other metrics for how many times an article is downloaded, how many times it's printed, seeing those as more accurate things. But I have to tell you, one co-author and I actually gamed that system one month where we got all the PTA parents and all our friends and family. We wanted to see how much we could move a needle, where they always print out in the journal's website the top 10, and we got ourselves bumped from 10 to 3. We could not get past Sonia Lubimovsky's happiness review. But they can be gamed, which is a reason why I take all of these with a grain of salt. Next slide. Just to show you the variation in impact factors, you have to know what's normal for your discipline. This is a list I might use. I do, as I said, psychosocial research on how families cope with cancer. These are journals I might consider. Now, the gold standard is the New England Journal of Medicine. None of us are going to get close to that. It's like, this is not a linear distribution. My journal that I edit is Annals. It's sitting in the middle, though it bumped up a point over the past year. For a master's thesis, for a smaller slice of a study, I might go to the Journal of Psychosocial Oncology. I might not because it's under 2, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't. Psycho-oncology. So again, look at all your journal's impact factors together. That shouldn't be the main kind of consideration. Next slide. So how do you increase your chances? It's not just throwing it out there like a Frisbee, which I get a lot of. I get a lot of inquiries. I'm thinking of doing a study, a comparative study. Would you be interested? They don't even tell me on what. So the idea is think ahead, choose the journal wisely. We've said that now, what, 4 or 5 times? That's because it's really critical. Read the journal's guidelines, their instructions for authors. Mine say we do not accept case reports. I got a case report this morning. So part of it is you're going to be wasting your time if you don't read all those guidelines. The same things your mentors are telling you is how you start research is how you end up for publication. You can't change your data. They are what they are. So work with your advisors over and over about good research, conceptualizing it, the design, the interpretation. This is a genre to learn how to write scientific or academic articles. And your faculty are really good at this. Your peers too, but we've just had more experience. We've hit more roadblocks. And again, no matter what discipline you're in, write clearly. Everybody has to understand it. Maybe you're not your parents, but everybody in the field should know what you're doing. If we have no clue what the study's about, it's not going to get accepted. Think back to you, Megan. Or not. Oh, one other thing that's very legal and important. With most journals, you have to submit a cover letter. Now that cover letter isn't sent to the reviewers. It's confidential only for the editor-in-chief and the managing editor. Part of it is you're helping to get yourself the best reviewers you can get for your article. So be sure in a sentence to describe your study. Tell us how it fits the journal's mission, what it's about briefly. You also usually have to include statements that it's not published or under review anywhere else. That's unethical. I was in a meeting this morning with an editor of the other large health journal about someone who had submitted to both our journals, and it was a reviewer who told us about this. No bad ethics here. You have to conduct your study according to ethical guidelines. Again, they vary by field, but for human subjects research, you have to have an IRB. For animal research, you have to follow the IACOT guidelines. Now, some journals allow you to suggest reviewers. Even if they don't, it's not terrible to put that in the cover letter. You can't, now you're going to say, oh, obviously, but it's not obviously. You're not putting in your colleagues, other people you've published with, your dissertation advisor, the people who love you, because we actually check the suggested reviewers to make sure that there aren't conflicts of interest. If you're going to suggest a reviewer, in one sentence, explain why they're a good person to review it. This person recently wrote a review on this topic. This person has published a book on this topic. So you're helping us, even though we have a huge pool, it might be, right, that person would be a great reviewer. So this is another way you can help yourself. And always provide your contact information. And if you already have a manuscript number, always put it in. Otherwise, we can't find your manuscript. So make it easier for the editors, and they'll just smooth it just that little bit. I think I'm done now, but I know.
You are. Such important advice. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I just wanted to take a moment to talk briefly about your rights as it pertains to the publication and really the ultimate readership of your published work, right? Because after you conduct the research and write the work, your peers review the work and edit the journal that publishes the work, authors are often asked to sign what's referred to as a copyright transfer agreement. And because copyright can only be given away in writing, and because these agreements are required by publishers, authors frequently sign them verbatim, sadly, often without even reading them. And that can have real implications for you and for the work that you've put all of this time into producing. So with the caveat that I am not your lawyer, and that in fact, I am not a lawyer at all, I thought we could take a moment to talk about copyright and the ways in which it can be used to support you and your work through this process. So what isn't widely known is that copyright is a constitutional right. After the right to a post office and before the right to hold tribunals lesser than the Supreme Court is Congress's right to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So basically providing an incentive to contribute to our intellectual and cultural pursuits as a society. Now, there are some exceptions. Unless you transfer your copy, as of 1976 Copyright Act, unless you transfer your copyright to, for instance, a publisher, you own copyright to your work as soon as your pen hits the paper or you type on your keyboard. There is no registration or big C, required. If two or more people jointly create a work, they are joint copyright holders with equal rights. So in academia, we often talk about, the emphasis on the first author, the person who will sign the contract or be considered the primary owner of the work. But in fact, from a copyright standpoint, as long as a contributor added some element to the written work, that contributor is an equal copyright holder. So that's something to think about no matter where your name appears within an author order. With some exceptions, work created as part of a person's employment is considered a work made for hire, and the copyright belongs to the employer. But for faculty researchers at CUNY, with some exceptions around patents and other types of content, you own the copyright to the scholarship that you produce as a part of your employment. And so I've linked to CUNY's intellectual property policy, should you wish to read that. Now, copyright is actually a bundle of 5 exclusive rights, right? So with your copyright, you have the right to reproduce the work, to create derivatives of it, to distribute it, to perform it, and publicly display it. And these rights can be put together as one full copyright, or they can be unbundled and split apart. Each of us on this call today, no matter where you are in your career, whether or not you've ever published a paper, you are a copyright holder. We all have more copyrights than we even know what to do with. And the vast majority of those copyrighted objects are never going to be profitable or released. That's okay. But it makes copyright a very confusing system. That because despite getting all of these great rights under copyright, we too often just give them away, not understanding the full extent of what we're doing. But not all rights have to be given away. You can parse out specific rights from the rest of them. They can be unbundled from the full rights granted by copyright. Licensing really enables us as copyright holders, whether we are the author or the publisher, to unbundle these 5 rights and give them to another party. Traditionally, publishers have wanted the full copyright. This is a holdover from the print-only days when it was easier for authors to give publishers all copyright so that they could manage reprint requests and other types of requests that would come in. But in actuality, as we move to this online world, the only right that publishers truly need is the right of first publication. So what this means in practice is ideally a non-exclusive right to publish and disseminate the work, perhaps with a brief embargo period to provide the publisher with a period of exclusivity, right? And why is this important? This is critical because your work is central to your career and the advancement of knowledge in your field. And you want that work to have as wide a readership as possible. And so this is why many researchers, publishers, and librarians, such as myself, advocate for what we refer to as open access, the free distribution of research online without legal, technical, or financial barriers. Now, it depends on the field and the quality of your research, but studies have shown that by making a work available open access, you can actually increase your citation rates by 200 to 600%, right? So there's a real incentive for journals to be open access, to increase those citations and their impact factor and other metrics, all of which come with their own flaws. But most of all, there's an incentive for you as a researcher to make your work available open access when possible so that you are widely read. So it's really no surprise that researchers have been demanding this for a while. New open access publishers are emerging, and legacy publishers are offering different levels of open access options. Now, there's a common misperception that in order to publish open access, you have to pay for open access, and that's not true. Publishing does come at a cost, but most open access journals do not charge a fee, especially those from newer publishers that have different financial models, some of which are library-based presses, right? Where we have moved funds that would traditionally pay for subscription journals to supporting library-based publishing. Some open access journals, especially those from large legacy commercial publishers, will charge, what's called an article processing charge, right? An APC. And this can range from $200 to upwards of $5,000. So it can be really unattainable for a lot of researchers. Some authors pay this out of their own pocket, but more often it's paid for by a grant or their institution. The journal may also offer an open access option in what is otherwise a subscription journal. We call this a hybrid journal, in which the article will be published by the journal no matter what. And by default, it will be paywalled. But the author may pay to make the individual article that they're releasing open access. So what does all of this mean for you? What this means is that if you submit to a journal with a fee, your department or institution may have some funds available, but honestly, they're typically not enough at CUNY to cover the full cost. CUNY does not have a central fund to support this, and those schools that do, so a number of R1s do have a central open access fund, they've really found that they're unsustainable and they quickly run out before the fall semester even finishes. So it's important to note that journals will offer a waiver or a reduced fee to authors that don't have funds to support them. These are sometimes by some journals limited to scholars in developing countries, but exceptions are made and it's always worth asking. Now, the really good news is that if you are submitting to a hybrid journal or even a paywalled journal, there are ways that you can make your work available open access. Many journals have policies that permit authors to submit a version of their manuscript to an open access repository, such as NIH's PubMed, or here at CUNY, we have CUNY Academic Works, which collects and freely shares the intellectual output of the university. Now, because of the agreements that authors may have signed with their publisher, they may not be able to submit that beautiful publisher's PDF with all of the publisher's formatting, but in most cases, they may submit the final edited and peer-reviewed version, just without the formatting, so typically the last Word doc. When I first joined CUNY almost 6 years ago, I conducted an analysis of all of the research articles produced by the CUNY community, so really looking at where CUNY faculty are already publishing and what the default policies for those journals are. And I did this by each school and found that for each school, between 85 and 97% of the articles being produced by the faculty were eligible for submission to an open access repository such as Academic Works without seeking any additional permission from the publisher. You can take that final draft Word doc and upload it to the repository. And that's important because works in Academic Works are downloaded over 1 million times each year from people in every state and every country. These are members of the public, yes. They are practitioners, so we hear regularly from nurses and doctors that are reading CUNY research and other educators as well. And they're also peers in your field who would not otherwise have access because of the paywall. But if you share, they're able to read it and then cite it. So if you are preparing to sign a contract, or honestly, if you've already signed one, it's important to read it. Does it ask for a copyright transfer? Or a non-exclusive or an exclusive license for one or more of those 5 bundled rights. But most of all, this is really an opportunity to ask yourself, what do you want to do with your work after it's published, right? Can you share it with your students? Post it on your website or an institutional repository? Can you rework it and publish it as a chapter in a book? These are critical questions to ask because they will be shaped by the contract, and you want to think about the life of your work after its publication. Now, I am not a lawyer, and I suspect many of you aren't either. You know, I will say it's actually a lot easier to work with journals about these issues than one might think. And whether you're about to sign a contract or even if you've already signed one, you can always return to the publisher and request changes in plain language for the things that you'd like to do. This can mean a compromise. For instance, they may allow you to share your work via a repository, but require that you wait that 6 months until after publication before making it, you know, publicly accessible online. You know, because at this stage, you've done the work of conducting your research, you've identified and evaluated and submit to that journal, you've communicated with the editors and responded to the feedback from your reviewers. And so you want to make sure that that work is read as widely as possible for the benefit of your career and knowledge in your field. And so with that, I know we've covered a lot. I think we will open it up for questions. I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Megan and Tracy. That was amazing. That was really, I learned a great deal as well. We have a few questions in the chat. Please, if anyone else out there has some questions, please type them in the chat. I guess I'll just start at the top. Cheney asked a question about having multiple potential venues where you can submit your article versus the ethical issue of only submitting it to one publisher at a time, which I think Tracy responded to. I don't know if you want to say a little more.
Yeah, basically, I just said, sorry if I wasn't clear. I'm suggesting you have 3 possible journals to submit to. So if the first one rejects it, you've got the next one on the list. But of course, you can only submit your manuscript at any time to one journal. Otherwise, it would be automatically rejected and it would not be a good thing.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important ethical standpoint. It's also a very practical one because ultimately each of those journals are going to have slightly different author guidelines. They're going to want different, you to submit it in different formats, perhaps include different sections. And so functionally, it's really important to write for that that first journal that you really want to, and then if it's rejected, you can move on down the line.
And the next question, I think, is actually a question for you. It's a question about paying for reproductions of images in fair use. Can you answer that question, Meg?
Oh, that's a great question and a big one. Especially in the humanities, there are going to be a lot of questions about if you are providing illustrations. There may be questions about just what you said, right? Like, do I need to pay for this image? Is it fair use to use this image? Fair use is always a matter of risk assessment, and each journal is going to have different feelings about how much risk they are willing to take. Ultimately, what I've observed is that most journals really look to the author for conducting that assessment or requiring them to obtain permissions. What those permissions are going to need, what permissions you're going to need and what fair use application is going to depend on the image of itself. And this is where the librarians at your campus, now we can't seek the permissions for you, but we may be able to assist you as you conduct that fair use assessment.
Thank you. Oh, I did see there was a question at the bottom about Meg and Tracy, is it okay if we make these slides available in addition to the recording? Okay, so we'll put that on our website. So you'll have both the slides with all the good information and also the recording. The next question was, this is from Pierce. I've written an article on something in business. I've been having problem researching the right journal to submit it in. I think this goes back to something that you addressed, Meg. What are some good places to find journal venues, I guess in particular subject areas?
Yeah, I mean, so I think my first question would be, what journals are you citing in writing that, that piece in business? What databases do you use to find journals, and how could you use that to maybe find some that you're less familiar with and perhaps haven't looked to before? There are some general directories, and so that again is Ulrich's and the Directory of Open Access Journals, which are on the slides, which we will be sharing. But I'd really start with your own citations and then go from there.
Great. I love this next question. This is actually something that often comes up when we do one of the things our office also does is responsible conduct of research workshops. And this comes up every time. But the question is, sometimes I've heard people plagiarize themselves. If you own the phrase or sentence, can't you use it again? I don't know if you have something to say about this, Megan. Wait, do you, Tracy, you have something to say about this?
I've been dealing with a case of this, so I've been reading the COPE cases and guidelines religiously. So this is sometimes called self-plagiarism.
Yeah.
Text recycling has a number of names: salami publishing, which is an actual term, piecemeal publishing. The idea is, even though, yes, you wrote it, you cannot lift sections of text and move them into other things that you've written without attribution, without citing your previous published work. Now, if you come up with a phrase that is yours, obviously you would use it again and again if you come up with some clever way to talk about the malaise we're all feeling during COVID. You could use that phrase again. And you often would say, as I've said before, or whatever. But what we're seeing more and more is people simply lifting introductory sections and lit reviews from one article and dropping them in another. They're doing research where you do a study and you have two outcomes and you write one article on outcome 1 and one on 2, and you have the same article except you cut and paste in depression instead of anxiety. That is self-plagiarism, and that is not allowed. So you have to be somewhat careful about this because yes, most journals do have plagiarism software that your article is run through before it shows up on an editor's desk. So that's something we've had in the sciences, in the behavioral sciences, we've had discussions about if you have a study you're writing several articles from, the method is the same, so that you can't really rewrite a method, it's what it is. But the plagiarism software is going to catch it. So one thing you need to be very honest about in your cover letter is, I've already published 2 things from this study, but they were on topic A and topic B, but the method section may look very similar. So then when I get that final cross-check number, I can actually look at which sections we're targeted. And if it's the methods, I can say, it's not a problem. So that's why we have to be very careful. If you want to look it up, it is called text recycling self-plagiarism. If you Google that, you'll find it.
Thank you. That's very, very well covered. So the next question is, does CUNY have an attorney who is accessible for referral? Also, does anyone in the group have access and willing to share a redacted contract that would reflect ideal terms? I think this is a question for you, Meg.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. So CUNY has a great set of attorneys. I'm not aware of one that works with faculty on their particular publication contracts, but I will say at each campus, there are 1 or more librarians who work in what we call scholarly communications issues, and who are available to talk through your contract with you. We, of course, are not lawyers and cannot provide legal guidance. But we can provide some education. I am also available to work with faculty and regularly do so, when they first receive that contract or even years later. One of my favorite stories, my first year at CUNY as a faculty member came to us and said, I wrote this textbook, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it's no longer published, but I want to make it available. How can we do that? And so we just went back to the publisher, got the rights, And now it's freely available online. And we just received an email yesterday from a faculty member who's using it in their instruction at a totally different institution. So, so these are always conversations that can be had, and we can support you in that.
Great, thank you. And this might also be a conversation. I mean, I could talk to Associate Vice Chancellor Schneider about this. Like, there might be some resources or somebody in the General Counsel's office that we would be able to, you know, ask some of these higher level questions to, sort of after you've gone through the scholarly communications librarian. But that's actually, because I mean, these issues are probably going to start coming up again and again, like even more as we use more open access resources. Okay, so the next question is from Tashuna Alberton. Just to be clear, the version we submit to CUNY Academic Works is the version that was accepted by the journal and that can occur as soon as the journal has accepted the manuscript. That is a question for you, Meg.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say typically the version that you can submit to CUNY Academic Works is that final accepted version. Many journals do require a 6-month embargo period, but we do have a feature in Academic Works that you can submit it at the time of acceptance, and we'll just set a clock. You can set it and forget it. And after the 6 months passes, we will automatically release it online. But if you have questions about what your publisher's default policies look like, there is likely a librarian at your campus who can work with you on that, and I'm available as well. I really love it when faculty reach out to me with questions about their work.
Just to say, it is 12:59 now. We'd like to keep this as, you know, we're going to try to cut it off right at 1 because we know everybody, as we said, our time is valuable. I will be keeping a record of the chat so we can develop a frequently asked questions. And Meg said that she'll be available also to answer your questions, and we're going to make all these materials online. Do we have a time for one more question, maybe? There's a question from Ronak Etamadpour, sorry. So about the conference proceedings, he has a question about conference proceedings and the journal for the same conference. If he makes minor changes, can it be submitted to the journal? Do you know about that? So, sort of conference proceedings versus journal articles?
If the conference proceedings includes just the abstract and it's published, there's no problem. If the entire manuscript is in there, and the conference proceedings are published, that's a publication. So you can't submit it to a journal with a few tweaks.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, it is now 1 o'clock. Thank you so much, all of you, for participating in our first Faculty Funding Fridays. As I said, these will be made available on our website. We will let you know that when it happens, and we hope to see you all at some of our future webinars. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Oh, and thanks, Meg.